So I was having coffee last week, and it was a really interesting conversation. It was with a friend who runs a small auto parts factory, just outside of Monterey.
Oh, right in the heart of the manufacturing hub.
Exactly. And for years, he's talked about the struggle, competing with cheaper imports. But he was in this surprisingly good mood. And he leans in, his voice gets all low and confident, and he taps the newspaper headline about these new tariffs on Chinese goods. He just says, finally, this is our chance. This is how we bring the factories home.
So for him, it's a lifeline, pure and simple.
Absolutely. He saw it as pure opportunity. A long-awaited shield for Mexican manufacturing, a way to finally close that trade gap with China. His conviction was, well, it was absolute. It was this whole narrative of national resurgence.
I can see that. From that perspective, on the ground, it must feel like the cavalry has arrived.
It did. But then I read the statement from Beijing.
And that's the other side of the coin.
A completely different side. The Chinese response was sharp. They called it a protectionist error, and they implied he was made under duress. And that's when the whole picture it completely shifted for me.
Right.
My friend's narrative of this sovereign economic policy, it just collided with this different, maybe uglier reality. The immense quiet pressure from the North.
The idea that the same tariffs he sees as a shield, others see as a symbol of capitulation almost.
Exactly. Mexico is caught just squarely between its colossal trading partner and the world's factory. And it feels like it just made a choice. And the most compelling question for me wasn't about the tariffs themselves. It was about who really wrote the bill.
And that right there is the core dilemma we are diving into today. You have Mexico, which has, it successfully positioned itself as the world's 12th largest economy, stuck between these two gravitational giants of global trade.
The U.S. and China.
The United States, which is its overwhelming primary export market, and on the other hand, China, which is its absolutely crucial source of imports. You can't function without either one.
So this is what we're going to unpack. This sweeping new tariff regime. Was it really what my friend in Monterey saw? A necessary industrial protection plan, something designed to bolster domestic industries?
Or is it something more complicated?
That's the question. Is it a forced geopolitical alignment, maybe dictated from Washington to secure trade leverage? Or is it just a massive economic gamble, one with completely unpredictable consequences for nearshoring, for global trade, for everything?
It's probably a bit of all three, but the balance of those motivations, the why behind it, that's what really matters. So, okay, let's unpack this. I think we have to start with the domestic intentions because on paper, Mexico is framing this as a crucial step toward its own economic independence.
The new economic shield.
That's the phrase they're using, and it's a powerful one.
Okay, so let's start there. If we look at the official narrative, the one coming out of Mexico City, it sounds like a major policy recalibration. What is the actual scope, the scale of this protectionism we're talking about?
The scope is, it's massive. And I don't think we can overstate the structural significance of this change.
More than just a tweak to trade policy.
I know, absolutely. This is arguably Mexico's most consequential shift in trade policy in decades. It fundamentally moves away from that open market, laissez-faire orthodoxy that really characterized the country's economic strategy since NAFTA. Since the mid-90s.
This is a generational shift.
It is. This new package, it targets 1,463 distinct product categories.
1,463 lines. That's incredibly broad. And while the policy uses this neutral language, non-free trade agreement partners, we all know who the primary target is here.
Right. It's not really a secret. While the tariffs technically impact countries like South Korea or India or Turkey, the measures are structurally designed to disproportionately affect China.
Because China lacks an FTA with Mexico.
Correct. It is a targeted maneuver, just wrapped in broad stroke language. And the scale of the tariffs is serious. They range from, say, 10% on some lower sensitivity goods, all the way up to 50% on some really crucial industrial sectors.
Okay, let's talk about those high-end tariffs. 50% is a massive barrier to entry. That's not just protection, that's a blockade. What specifically is Mexico trying to block, or on the flip side, protect with that?
The proposed 50% tariffs are focused squarely on the most sensitive industrial sectors. These are the areas where Chinese overcapacity has been felt not just in Mexico, but globally.
So things like steel.
Steel, exactly. A foundational industrial input. Also textiles, and critically, light cars and key auto parts. Mexico is making a very strategic play here to protect its foundational industries.
And the government's official line on this is what? How do they justify it?
They're framing this as a necessary response to what they call distorted pricing.
So dumping, basically.
Essentially, yes. The idea that foreign oversupply, which is often subsidized, is unfairly undermining national production and preventing Mexican firms from achieving scale. They're saying the game is rigged.
So this isn't just a random act of protectionism, then. It's tied into a larger, articulated government strategy. You mentioned Plan Mexico earlier. Can we delve a bit deeper into that? What are the key pillars of this national resurgence strategy?
Absolutely. The tariffs are intended to align directly with this broader government policy, which is known informally as Plan Mexico. And this plan, it really has three intertwined strategic goals.
Okay.
First is import substitution, actively seeking to replace foreign-sourced inputs and final goods with domestically produced alternatives, especially in high-value sectors.
So make it here instead of buying it from abroad.
Precisely. The second goal is increasing national and regional content. They want to ensure that goods produced in Mexico, particularly those that are exported under the USMCA, contain a higher percentage of content that's actually manufactured within the North American region.
Right, strengthening the regional bloc.
And third, and this is more of a branding exercise, is relaunching the Made in Mexico brand. The goal is to elevate the quality and the competitiveness of Mexican manufacturing on the global stage.
That shift, though, from decades of free market policy to planned import substitution.
Yeah.
That is a colossal ideological pivot. If they're serious about Plan Mexico, they need to be sure these tariffs deliver a functional economic shield, not just a political one.
Precisely. And the challenge there is immense because this whole strategic realignment, it just shines a spotlight on this colossal structural imbalance that the tariffs are supposedly designed to fix.
The trade gap with China.
The trade gap with China.
Okay, here's where we need the stark reality check. Give us the numbers on that China-Mexico deficit, because I think the magnitude is often hard to really grasp.
The imbalance is staggering, and it forms the main domestic justification for this entire policy shift.
Yeah.
Mexico is trying to reduce its colossal trade deficit with China. So let's look at the 2024 figures. Mexico imported a jaw-dropping $128.5 billion worth of goods from China.
Okay, $128.5 billion. Now, for comparison, what did Mexico export to China?
Only $9.19 billion.
Wait, I need to process that scale. So Mexico bought, what is that? 14 times more from China than it managed to sell back.
Yeah.
128 billion in, 9 billion out.
Exactly. And this resulted in a historic deficit of $119.3 billion.
$119 billion.
119. To put that into perspective for you, that deficit figure alone is equivalent to roughly 1/5 of Mexico's entire annual federal budget. It's an enormous leakage of capital year after year after year.
That makes the political imperative to close the gap. I mean, it's understandable. But here's the critical counter-argument, right? Isn't a massive trade deficit often a sign of healthy domestic consumer demand? And more importantly, access to cheap, high-quality inputs that make your other exports globally competitive.
That is a crucial point of debate among trade economists. And for decades, Mexico successfully did exactly that. They used cheap Chinese inputs to fuel their massive export machine, which was aimed almost entirely at the U.S. market.
Right.
China is Mexico's second largest import source. It commands a 21.5% share of all of Mexico's imports. If Mexico is going to export cars to the U.S., those cars need steel, they need electronics, they need microchips, and those components, they often come from Asia.
So the very efficiency that makes Mexico this powerhouse exporter depends on the supply chain they are now trying to tax.
It's the central tension. It's the core paradox of this whole policy. If we look at the input dependency for Mexico's biggest export machine, which is motor vehicles, research shows that 23.5% of the inputs needed for that main export chapter come directly from China.
A quarter of the inputs for their number one export.
A quarter. And for the second largest export chapter, which is a broad category for machinery, nuclear reactors, boilers, basically electronics and heavy industrial equipment, 31.5% of the inputs are sourced from China.
So this isn't just about finished consumer goods on shelves. This is the essential raw and intermediate material that's fueling Mexican assembly lines, which are mostly sending product north.
Exactly. This is the lifeblood of the export economy.
That sets up the perfect scenario for what you call the double-edged sword effect. You want to shield the finished product, but the factory runs on the cheap Chinese components you're now penalizing.
Which is exactly where the story of Mateo, the furniture maker, becomes this real-world warning, a cautionary tale.
Okay, tell us about Mateo.
He's the epitome of unintended consequences. Mateo runs a medium-sized furniture fabrication business, and initially he was ecstatic about the 50% tariff on finished Chinese furniture imports. He saw a captive domestic market for his locally made Hecho in Mexico chairs and tables.
He assumed the government was protecting the final product.
His final product.
Exactly. But the devil, as always, is in the technical minutiae of trade policy, specifically in the harmonized system, or HS, codes. This is the international classification system that defines what a product is for tariff purposes, and it is incredibly specific.
So the classification is so detailed that even like a specialized screw or a little bracket for a chair would have its own unique tariff code, separate from the code for the finished chair itself.
That's precisely right. And when Mateo reviewed the detailed tariff list with his accountant, the panic set in. Because the new duties didn't just cover finished chairs, they covered inputs.
Oh, no.
They covered the specialized aluminum brackets that give his sectional sofas their modularity, and they covered the synthetic upholstery fabrics he uses. He imports these from China for a simple reason. They are not produced domestically at the required quality or scale, or at the price point he needs to maintain his margins. So the immediate result isn't local competition flourishing. It's Mateo's own production costs skyrocketing because his essential inputs are suddenly 50% more expensive on the first day of 2026. This doesn't help plan Mexico if local suppliers can't fill that gap.
The grim reality is that without a rapid, massive, and concurrent effort to enhance domestic productivity and to quickly build local supply chains for those specialized inputs, which is, an intensive multi-year, multi-billion-dollar government project, these higher costs will simply erode the competitiveness of Mexican manufacturers.
They can't substitute the input.
So they have to absorb the costs.
And who ultimately pays for that absorption?
The local consumer.
Through inflation.
Correct. The intended shield risks becoming a substantial inflationary burden. And we see this risk across the entire spectrum, from the automotive sector, which is incredibly sensitive to input costs, all the way down to general consumer nodes. If costs are too high, Mexican manufacturers can't compete globally, even with the USMCA shield, and they certainly have to raise prices for consumers at home.
This makes the policy's potential for disruption just enormous. However, you mentioned the legislative process suggests Mexico is really committed to this structural shift. What happened in Congress? I heard the original proposal was a bit different.
That institutional shift is key to understanding the government's long-term commitment here. Initially, the proposal came from the executive branch, and it actually included a potential one-year sunset clause.
So it could have just been temporary, a political reaction.
It felt like it could be, yes, but Congress took control. And while they undertook what they called surgical revisions, they softened roughly 2/3 of the proposed tariff lines, probably to ease some of that short-term supply chain disruption. They fundamentally altered the nature of the policy.
How did they make it structural? What did they change?
2 critical moves. First, they removed the one-year sunset clause. So this isn't a trial run. This is durable, long-term policy.
It's permanent.
And second, they removed the executive branch's unilateral authority to adjust these tariffs quickly. They placed legislative oversight over future changes. This means that to reduce or eliminate the tariffs in the future, the executive has to go through the slow, laborious process of getting congressional approval.
That is a profound move. It signals to the world, and especially to China, that this is not some temporary negotiating tactic.
Yeah.
This is a structural, long-term decision to move away from that open market orthodoxy and to embed protectionism deeply within the legislative framework.
It creates certainty, for better or for worse,
Right.
But it also creates rigidity. It signals that this policy is intended to be durable and structural. The fact that the revisions softened so many lines suggests an intense political battle took place.
I can imagine.
Likely driven by powerful domestic import lobbies who relied heavily on specific Chinese inputs. But ultimately, the structural framework prioritizing industrial protection won out.
That permanent changes the entire calculation. If it's not just about a temporary fix for furniture makers like Mateo, and it's this deep structural shift, then we have to connect the dots. We have to ask how much of this bill was actually written in Washington.
And that is the essential second layer of this analysis, because these tariffs function not just as economic policy, but as diplomatic currency.
A signal to the U.S.
A very loud one. You have to remember, over 80% of all Mexican exports head north to the U.S. Mexico's entire economic stability hinges on that single relationship.
And the elephant in the room is the looming USMCA review.
Absolutely. The crucial U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, the USMCA, requires a review in 2026. Mexico needs the U.S. to be amicable during that process. It covers everything from rules of origin to labor standards.
So this is a goodwill gesture.
It's more than that. This tariff package serves as tangible, proactive evidence that Mexico is aligning itself with Washington's primary geopolitical and trade concern.
Which is, famously, the alleged Chinese backdoor.
Yeah.
The idea that China is using Mexico as a strategic export platform to bypass high U.S. tariffs.
The alignment is stark. I mean, the U.S. national security strategy explicitly seeks to strengthen its position in the Western Hemisphere and prevent countries from cooperating with rivals, particularly in manufacturing.
And Mexico showing it's a team player.
By imposing these steep, non-FTA tariffs, especially that 50% on Chinese light cars, auto parts, and steel Mexico, is proving it is closing that supposed backdoor. It is a direct response to Washington's complaints about Chinese firms circumventing American duties by slapping the Made in Mexico label on minimally processed goods.
That certainly makes perfect sense why Chinese firms would have chosen Mexico in the first place,
Yeah.
right? Especially starting after the U.S.-China trade war kicked off.
That's the root of the whole nearshoring boom. The high U.S. tariffs imposed on Chinese goods, which began back in 2018, created these powerful incentives for Chinese firms to engage in what's called tariff jumping.
Tariff jumping.
The basic strategy was simple. You relocate your final assembly, or at least partial production, to Mexico. By doing this, you aim to meet the USMCA's rules of origin requirements, which then allows you to ship the finished product tariff-free to the massive U.S. market.
So did that investment surge happen immediately?
Yeah.
Right after the 2018 trade war began?
No, and this is a crucial nuance that's often missed in the headlines. These kinds of investment decisions, they involve massive sunk costs. You're building factories, relocating machinery, restructuring entire supply chains. They're highly sensitive to policy uncertainty.
So the companies waited.
They waited. They wanted to ensure that the U.S. policy, particularly the tariffs on China, was permanent and bipartisan.
So they were waiting for certainty that the Trump-era trade policies were going to stick around.
Exactly. The most dramatic acceleration, the real surge in Chinese foreign direct investment, or FDI, it didn't happen until the most recent period, 2023 and 2024.
Just now, basically.
Just now. Research findings show that in those 2 years alone, 59 Chinese FDI projects, representing approximately $5.7 billion, materialized in Mexico. This delayed response, it confirms that these firms waited for policy permanence. Specifically, after the Biden administration maintained the bulk of the Trump-era trade policies before committing to those irreversible investments. They needed political stability before sinking that kind of capital.
Wow. That makes the timing of Mexico's new tariffs even more shocking. Just as Chinese investment finally accelerated, recognizing Mexico as a stable export platform, Mexico essentially yanked the rug out from underneath them.
The timing conflict is profound, and the mapping of where this money went, it just confirms the export strategy. This Chinese FDI is heavily concentrated in the northern manufacturing corridor. It's focused entirely on logistical proximity to the U.S. market.
So states like Nuevo León.
Nuevo León led, capturing 24.2% of the total documented investment value. Coahuila was next with 13.2%. Their location choice was entirely driven by the distance to Texas and the U.S. border crossings.
This brings us to the panic experienced by Sophia, the logistics coordinator you mentioned. Her entire business model was based on the premise of this loophole, which just collapsed overnight.
Sophia's company, it's a subsidiary of a Chinese auto parts giant, operating out of an industrial park in Monterrey. It was the classic embodiment of the perfect loophole model.
What do they do?
They specialized in minimal assembly. Their process involved importing 90% of the necessary components, the expensive high-tech parts, directly from China. They would perform the final 10% of assembly or finishing work in Mexico, and then, crucially, ship the finished product tariff-free to the U.S., having met the minimum requirements of the USMCA rules of origin.
So they were benefiting simultaneously from U.S. protectionism against China and Mexico's preferential trade agreements with the U.S. They were the ultimate middleman exporting Chinese capital masked as North American products.
Correct. But with the passage of the new Mexican tariff bill, those Chinese components they import into Mexico, that 90% input, are now immediately hit with a 50% levy effective January 1st, 2026.
A 50% cost increase on 90% of your materials. I mean, That instantly renders their business model unprofitable.
Instantly. Sophia's account of managers just scrambling to reroute shipping containers that are currently crossing the Pacific, it illustrates the immediacy of the crisis. If those specialized containers arrive in January, the company faces a financial catastrophe. The landed cost of their goods is suddenly 50% higher than they budgeted for.
It's an overnight disaster for these specific export platform firms.
The geopolitical alignment with the U.S. has effectively stripped away the made-in-Mexico shield for these Chinese origin assembly operations. It converted their export platform into a tax target.
But this geopolitical pressure, it also interacts with Mexico's own existing domestic policies in some really unexpected, almost contradictory ways. You mentioned something called the Zona Libre de la Frontera Norte, the ZLFN.
This is a fascinating study in policy constraint. The ZLFN program, launched by the government in 2019, was a domestic place-based policy. It was intended to stimulate development in the 43 municipalities that are directly on the U.S. border.
And what did it do?
It attempted to combine two very different policy levers. First, significant tax reductions. They slashed the value-added tax, the VAT, from 16% to 8%, and they reduced the corporate income tax, the ISR, by half.
Okay, tax cuts, that makes sense.
But second, they mandated a massive concurrent increase in the minimum wage in these same border municipalities.
That wage hike was substantial, right? This wasn't just minor regulatory tinkering.
It was revolutionary. I mean, the minimum wage in these ZLFN border municipalities increased by a staggering 425% between 2018 and 2024.
425%.
Yes. This created a significant labor cost differential, a 51% premium compared to non-border areas of Mexico. So the ZLFN policy essentially packaged tax incentives with substantially higher labor costs.
So the question for a Chinese manufacturer looking for the optimal export base was, does the tax break outweigh the much higher labor cost?
And empirically, the evidence suggests it did not, at least not for this tariff jumping model that prioritizes low input and low labor costs. Research shows that ZLFN municipalities actually received less Chinese FDI compared to non-ZLFN regions within the very same border states.
So wait, why would a company choosing a border location ignore tax breaks that are right at the border? That seems counterintuitive.
It does, but for these export-oriented Chinese manufacturers, the tax incentives, specifically the VAT reduction, were largely irrelevant.
How so?
Exporters already have established mechanisms to recover or avoid VAT on inputs they purchase for export. So the tax incentives, they really only benefit companies selling to the domestic Mexican market. However, that substantially higher minimum wage, that 51% labor cost premium, that was a major inescapable cost disadvantage for labor-intensive manufacturing.
So even though they wanted to be close to the U.S., they strategically chose non-ZLFN areas, like the industrial parks in Nuevo León, which are outside the specific ZLFN municipalities, to capture the logistical advantages while avoiding the higher wage premium imposed by the domestic policy.
It just highlights the extreme sophistication of FDI decision-making and the sensitivity of global capital. While the Mexican government's intention with the ZLFN was noble, boosting local incomes, the high wage floors actively constrained the benefits they could have derived from these broader nearshoring trends. It shows that domestic policies, no matter how well-intentioned, can create unintended barriers to specific types of foreign investment.
It paints a picture of extreme complexity. Mexico is juggling its commitment to its massive U.S. trade relationship, its desperate need to address the trade deficit with China, and its own conflicting domestic development policies. And it's all being mediated through this one single tariff package. But now we have to turn to the reaction from the other side. Beijing is not taking this realignment lightly.
No, not at all. China's reaction has been swift, it's been formal, and it has been forceful. They are not waiting to see if Mexico actually implements the tariffs in 2026. They're reacting now to the legislative approval and to the structural permanence we just discussed.
What are they saying officially?
China's Ministry of Commerce has explicitly said they oppose all forms of unilateral tariff hikes. And they're urging Mexico to act prudently, to strengthen communication, and to correct what they call unilateralism and protectionism.
So the message is clear. You are acting unilaterally, and you're doing it under external pressure. But they didn't just stop at diplomatic rhetoric, right? They launched a formal investigation.
And that is the escalation that truly matters. At the end of September, China's Ministry of Commerce initiated a formal trade and investment barrier investigation against Mexico. This is a deep, formalized legal probe. It's scheduled to conclude within 12 to 18 months.
So what does that mean, practically?
China is essentially using its own trade laws to scrutinize Mexico's new restrictions. They're viewing this as the U.S. enlisting its trade partners to economically isolate them, and they're building a legal case against it.
What are the typical consequences of an investigation like that if China finds in its own favor?
Well, if the probe finds that Mexico is violating international trade norms or unfairly restricting Chinese commerce, Beijing has several avenues for retaliation. They could impose equivalent tariffs on specific Mexican imports, but given the trade deficit, that wouldn't hurt Mexico much.
Right, they don't buy enough.
Exactly. But they can also deploy asymmetrical non-tariff strategies. Things like increasing sanitary inspections, slowing down customs clearance, or targeting very specific industries that rely heavily on the Chinese market.
And their initial countermeasure was a perfect illustration of this asymmetrical strategy.
It was symbolic, but it was also highly strategic. China initiated an anti-dumping investigation into Mexican pecan exports.
Pecans.
Pecans. This is a small but very sharp signal. While pecans do not represent a large percentage of Mexico's overall exports, they demonstrate Beijing's capacity to escalate disputes using targeted, sector-specific pain.
Why pecans, though? Why hit an agricultural product that has nothing to do with auto parts or steel tariffs? Seems so random.
This strategy is borrowed directly from China's playbook in previous trade disputes, like the ones with the U.S. or with Australia. When they want to apply political pressure, they target industries that are often geographically concentrated, politically sensitive, or trying hard to diversify.
I see.
It reminds Mexico that China can target politically relevant sectors like agriculture, which is vital to states like Sinaloa or Sonora to inflict pain, even if the overall trade balance is massively in China's favor. It's an effective way to leverage local fear to influence national policy.
And this brings us to the perspective of Alejandro, the Sinaloa agricultural exporter, who's now terrified of becoming collateral damage in a geopolitical chess game he never even asked to play.
Alejandro is the pawn sacrifice in this game. He spent years meticulously building that export market in Asia, establishing relationships in Shanghai and Hong Kong, specifically trying to diversify his business away from a sole reliance on the U.S. market.
And
now he faces the chilling prospect that his entire supply chain, his investment in Asia, could be targeted by Chinese trade retaliation, simply because his government sought geopolitical alignment with Washington in a completely different sector.
he fears China's quiet trade retaliation, suddenly facing insurmountable technical barriers, endless regulatory delays, or prohibitive duties that just lock him out of the world's second largest market.
It underscores a crucial vulnerability. While Mexico's overall dependence on exports to China is minimal, it's only about 1.4% of its total exports. Specific sectors and individual exporters like Alejandro are critically exposed to this kind of targeted asymmetrical retaliation.
And connecting this to the bigger picture, China is signaling something much broader. They're willing to weaponize trade against any country that aligns with U.S.-driven protectionism.
That's the real message here. This leads to the broader implications. China's forceful reaction to Mexico is not just about Mexico's specific trade rules. It's a message to emerging economies everywhere.
A warning shot.
It's a powerful messaging function aimed at the entire global South. Mexico is not unique in this position. Many emerging economies, whether you're talking about Southeast Asia, Africa, or other parts of Latin America, are feeling intense pressure from the U.S. to decouple from Chinese technology and manufacturing.
So, by reacting so strongly here,
China signals to those other emerging economies that adopting U.S.-style protectionist policies comes with clear and demonstrable economic and political consequences.
So this becomes a test case. If Mexico suffers real economic pain from this alignment, other nations will be much, much warier about implementing similar China-targeting tariffs in the future.
Exactly. In this new era of fragmenting global trade, where nations are increasingly being pushed to choose sides between the major economic powers, Beijing is illustrating the costs of that choice. The eventual success or failure of China's countermeasures against Mexico will significantly influence how dozens of other nations structure their trade and investment policies moving forward.
This entire deep dive, it just reveals the incredibly precarious position Mexico is in. It is simultaneously trying to shield its domestic industry through Plan Mexico, close its gargantuan trade deficit with China, and secure its indispensable, $840 billion relationship with the U.S., all through one sweeping structural tariff package.
The analysis really shows that Mexico's government truly believes these tariffs are a necessary shield. a shield for domestic industrial resurgence, and a political necessity to secure their future with the U.S., particularly ahead of that USMCA review. They aim to substitute crucial imports and stabilize their internal markets against pricing distortions.
But the risks are immediate, and they're compounding. They face the risk of self-sabotage, like we saw with Mateo and the furniture inputs. They're risking inflation and eroding the competitiveness of their own export base.
And they face the geopolitical backlash. We saw that with Sophia. Risking the immediate shutdown of Chinese tariff-jumping FDI, the very investment that was supposed to fuel this nearshoring growth, and attracting targeted, asymmetrical retaliation from Beijing, which threatens completely non-related sectors like agriculture, represented by Alejandro.
It seems like the biggest unintended consequence, the most immediate threat, is taxing those Chinese inputs that their own factories need to survive.
That's the heart of it. The ultimate gamble here, then, it's a monumental race against time and capacity.
A race against the clock.
It is. This whole geopolitical choice, it hinges on a singular, massive gamble. Can Mexico rapidly develop the industrial capacity, the specialized aluminum brackets, the electronics components, the auto parts, to replace the low-cost, high-quality Chinese inputs it is now taxing?
It's a huge question.
The alternative is that this protective shield ends up raising prices, fueling domestic inflation, and slowing down the very export sectors it needs to power its economic rise. The fate of Plan Mexico really rests on whether local suppliers can fill that $119 billion void before the tariffs strangle the very production lines that have come to rely so heavily on China.